Welcome, everyone. This is our very first broadcast in many that we'll be doing each month on the Hebrew roots, and then particular aligning with the Hebrew roots of our faith. And so this month we are featuring the beginning of summer, beginning of the summer season, as well as the beginning of I know I keep having to where am I turning? Also, it's the beginning, or tomorrow will be the beginning of Tammuz. So we are preparing to celebrate the Rosh Chodesh, which is the head of the month. It's the first day of the month of Tammuz. And the new month is denoted by the appearance of a new moon, right? So the Hebrew calendar differs a little bit from the Gregorian calendar. The Gregorian calendar, that's the one that we use, and it's been adopted pretty widely through the West. There's an important way that it's different. That main difference being that the Hebrew calendar is it's lunar and solar. So if you think of it one way, the moon is unaware of the time of year because it doesn't have a cycle that connects it to the year. In other words, all new moons are the same regardless at what time of the year that they occur. So therefore, to count the years, we use the sun. And the reason that the Hebrews use the sun is because apart from its daily rotation, it returns to the same exact place in the sky 365 days, 6 hours every year. So in that way, the sun knows no months and the moon knows no years, right? So that's why the Hebrews use both the lunar and solar calendar to calculate their time.
That's cool.
And yeah, it's kind of cool. And every month represents a movement of time through God's intended season for our lives. Every week, every month, every year contains your unique story set within God's season. And in this way, there's both a familiarity and a newness to every season, to every month. The familiarity is what keeps us anchored in God's purposes, and the newness is what keeps us living in anticipation of how his story for our lives is going to unfold. So I want to start by reciting, this is the blessing of the new month. I'm going to butcher this word, so forgive me in advance. Birchat HaChodesh. And it says, may it be your will, O Lord, our God and the God of our forefathers, that you inaugurate this month of Tammuz upon us for goodness and for blessing. May you give us a long life, a life of peace, a life of goodness, a life of blessing, a life of sustenance, a life of physical health, a life in which there is awe of heaven and fear of sin, a life in which there is no humiliation, a life of sufficient wealth and honor, a life in which we will have love of Torah, the law, and reverence of God, a life in which Adonai fulfills our heartfelt requests for good. Amen.
That's really beautiful.
Yeah, I love that blessing. It's kind of cool.
Yes, I love that too. So this is where we wanted to talk a little bit about the months and specifically this new month that we are about to enter into. So the ancient Jews, they recognized that every month was a new prophetic season. It was an opportunity for something new, and every month was different. And it has its own meaning and its own purpose for us to move forward in God's plan. So to understand the month helps us to stay in God's timing. And it's in step also with the Holy Spirit. That's what we love about aligning so much. So the Jews held a celebration at the beginning of every month. They came together and they literally celebrated. They feasted, they praised God, and they gave him what was called a first fruits offering. Rosh Chodesh is how you say that.
Yeah.
And they listened to the prophets to get direction for the month. And so by staying in step, they prospered. God prospered them. They stayed in that alignment. And so that is what we're doing at the head of each month. We want to come here and we'll come live like this and we talk about the month. And that's called Rosh Chodesh. It's the first fruits. And it's to take that first day and set it apart and make it holy. And it's a Sabbath. It's a Sabbath day. It's meant to rest, to celebrate him, to make sure that you're having gratitude, that you're showing that gratitude for God and that you're resting in him, and God blesses that. So as we celebrate, we do this for many ways. We do this at the head of the month. We do this at the head of the week with Sabbath. And we also, it's a teaching, the first fruits teaching is with your money, right? Where you give that first part of your money and God blesses the rest. And you use that to glorify God. That's the teaching of the first fruits teaching. So it's in that rhythm that you get to experience his blessings. So the Torah, we start counting the months with Nisan. So if you look on this slide right here, we start with the first month of Nisan, and it was the month that God delivered his people from bondage. And it was so significant that he changed the order of the months to start from there, because it used to start, now we're in the 7th month. That's why the New Year, the Jewish New Year, is not in that month, which was confusing to me at first. I was like, wait, why? But God is so amazing, and he has so many celebrations. So he starts counting with the month of Nisan, and that's when he first delivered his people from bondage, and everything changed. And from that time forward, the months would be counted from that deliverance. So literally every month we are reminded as we count that we are this far removed from a spirit of slavery. So we're entering in 4 months removed from a spirit of slavery, 4 months and thousands of years, right?
Yeah, right.
But that is so significant to me. I think that's beautiful. That's a beautiful part. So the year begins with a surge of exhilaration. Imagine that the Israelites escape generations of bondage that they've been in slavery, right? And then they witness Egypt, the most mighty and corrupt nation in the world at that time, reduced to ruin by the God of Israel. So in the 2nd month, that's the month of Iyar, and that's the month of transition, where God is taking them and showing them who he is, so that they would know, not just here, but also here. And then, and as Israel made the trip from Egypt to Mount Sinai, they experienced miracles and many times of testing.
Yeah.
So that is a testing month, right? In the wilderness, in the desert, whatever you want to call it. But these times of testing are always opportunities to experience God in deeper ways. So if you have experienced times of testing, desert times, know that that is when you look back, you grew deeper and closer to God than ever. Yeah. So 50 days later, you came to the month of Sivan. That's the month we're just leaving. Today is the last day, right, of that month. And that's when they would experience the most powerful revelation of light and truth that has ever transpired on the planet. That's how powerful that was. That was Shavuot. That was the giving of the Torah. So imagine that was when Moses came down with the 10 Commandments. So 1,500 years later, on that same day, that was in the New Testament, Pentecost, when God would pour out his Holy Spirit, and they would experience something of light and truth that probably was at least the equal, maybe even bigger, right? So, but despite all of these eyewitness encounters with God, the Israelites still lost their grip on their faith. They were young in their faith, I guess, and they sinned with the golden calf. Yeah. And this was a transgression of horrendous proportions. Honestly, this was huge. And it set in motion a downward spiral that would start on the 17th of this month of Tammuz, and it will culminate 3 weeks later into the next month of Av, which we will learn a lot about next month. Yeah. But now let's focus on Tammuz.
Okay. So I mentioned that each of the Hebrew months have, parts to them, right? There's themes, there's ideas, there's meaning in it. In other words, that God invests each month. So each of the Hebrew months are connected to one of the 12 tribes. They're connected to one of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and they're also connected to one of the 12 constellations. And then these 3 elements are woven into the theme for Tammuz. And then we're going to be going deeper into each of these as we explore what God has for us this month. Mm-hmm. So we're going to start by giving you some context for each of these 3 elements. later on, we'll connect them all together as we go deeper into the purpose of the month and then how to apply those purposes to your life. So Reuben was the firstborn of Jacob's 12 children. His mother was Leah. And as the firstborn, and this is kind of a key thing to remember, as the firstborn son, he enjoyed a position of privilege, and he was also destined to inherit a double portion of his father's estate. Reuben was also meant to be the leader of the 12 tribes, as well as the priest of his family. Unfortunately, he committed adultery with Jacob's concubine Bilhah, and like Esau before him, he lost his birthright. His double portion was taken away and given to Joseph. His leadership was taken away and given to Judah. And his priesthood was taken away and given to Levi.
That is so powerful. Wow.
And intense. Yeah. It's kind of intense.
I did not know. When we were studying this, it was so cool to see that, because you know that each of them had that, but I didn't know that it came from that.
Yeah. You know, one thing I'll just say, like as a side, that's kind of cool is that there's so much to know that it's almost like the deeper you go in and the more that you see, you're like, wow, I didn't know that. Oh, I didn't know. And then you start to see connections between things and you're like, oh my gosh, I never knew that before. And then, so it's kind of an exciting process, honestly. And that's part of kind of the Hebrew mindset, you know, is that you never get to the end of God. God is very personal and very intimate. You just never get to the end of him. Therefore, you can never get to the end of questions. So every question leads to an answer that allows you to ask a better question. And that's something that we found to be very, very true as we were going through and studying out this month for ourselves.
Oh, so true. So I love this. I love connecting to the letters, and the letters have numbers, and I just love all of that. So this month is connected to the letter Het. And it means light radiating from your eyes. And we know that in so many ways the devil tries to put our lights out, right? So many ways. It's also the Hebrew, it's connected to the Hebrew letter 8, which has incredible significance. It is a new beginning. And so this is a month of new beginnings and a fresh start. So what is so powerful about this month, and think about this throughout the month, is that you can come to God, and always with a posture of humility and asking him for a new beginning, a new start, and aligning with that. Aligning with that is so incredible. So the word life is a Het word. In fact, the symbol that we're showing you right here, it is the symbol of life. It literally is. So Romans 8 says, if the spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, he who raised Christ Jesus will also give life to your mortal bodies through his spirit. So powerful. So it's a Het word, right? And I don't even know, it's coming to my mind, though, there's a Hebrew saying to life. And I'm trying to remember what that is. But that's what I'm thinking of. Okay, but sin is also a Het word. So that what we're talking about is that this month brings us a choice. It's to choose life or to choose fear. To choose sin, but to choose fear. And as we will see that, as we look deeper at the things that happened over this month in Hebrew history.
And so the third element of, or idea that's kind of bound up in the month of Tammuz is Cancer. Okay, so the constellation of Cancer is represented by the crab. And the symbol of the crab reminds us to kind of notice those areas where we've become crusty and hard-shelled, you know, also those areas where we're soft and vulnerable. Areas of our life where we walk in one direction and then the other, because, you know, a crab doesn't walk straight on, it walks side to side.
Wow.
And then how our sharp claws can both wound and protect, right? So there's, you know, there's this balance, right? Like we just talked about with the letter Het, you know, there's these two elements that, you know, operate in balance. There's sin, there's life, you know. And so the crab lives in water. Water is an element that signifies emotion, and likewise, water can be tranquil or water can be choppy. So as you assess your life, it kind of causes you to question how you would describe it. Would you describe your life as tranquil, or would you describe it as choppy? Do your waters run deep, or are they shallow and stagnant? By the way, let me say as a sidebar, this idea of self-evaluation is not to, dump on the shame. Please don't go on Expedia.com and book a guilt trip. That's not what this is about. This is just about being honest and being transparent, and then inviting God into those spaces that he reveals to you. That's all. So anyways, all right. Now, some crabs, it's interesting to note, actually outgrow their shells. And so they have to search out larger shells in order to accommodate their growth. In a similar way, if we're not inviting God to remove the shell and allow ourselves to become vulnerable to him, then we risk becoming hardened. And we risk being unable to step into the next season of growth that he's inviting us into. So one of the things you can do is declare that every shell around you will break, and declare that you will open yourself to God, that you will ask him to guard your heart, guard your eyes this month, so that you will avoid the mistakes that Reuben made. And of course, we're going to be going into some of those mistakes in much greater detail a little bit later on. I wanted to offer, by way of context too, just sort of a brief timeline of this month, because the interesting thing is, and I didn't know, I knew some things, I just had no idea the scope and scale. A lot has happened in Hebrew history during this month.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot. And not just, there was a kite festival one year. I mean, the big things, important things, things that literally changed the trajectory of Israel's history, things that shifted entire paradigms. So probably the first and arguably the most important, we'll get into in a moment, but on the 17th day of the Jewish month of Tammuz, Jews the world over, to this day, traditionally fast to commemorate the calamities that befell them on this ominous day. According to Rabbi Elihu Kittov's Book of Our Heritage, the purpose of such fasts is to, quote, awaken hearts towards repentance through recalling our forefathers' misdeeds which led to calamities. So for the Jewish people, the 17th of Tammuz in particular is the day when everything changed. It's a day that draws up wells of sadness, nostalgia, and disappointment. It's a day when they contemplate their potential, when they consider both individually and collectively what might have been.
Wow.
Now, I wasn't able to find an exact historical proof of this, so I'm just going to be explaining this in terms of traditionally, it's believed that several tragic events occurred on the 17th of Tammuz. However, we can say that they all happened during this month. Whether they happened on the 17th or not, they definitely happened this month. The first of these, Moses descends from Mount Sinai, sees the people building the golden calf, breaks the first set of tablets carrying the 10 commandments. The 12 spies were sent to explore the promised land. In sometime around 540 BC, King Manasseh, who was one of Judah's most wicked kings, placed an idol inside the holy sanctuary of the temple. Wow, that's pretty, wow.
Yeah.
In 586 BC, according to the Jerusalem Talmud, temple priests stopped offering daily sacrifices due to the shortage of sheep caused by Babylon's siege of Jerusalem. And then a year later, in 587 BC, Nebuchadnezzar and his Babylonian forces successfully breached the walls of Jerusalem and brought them to an end. So, continuing further, in 70 AD, the Romans, led by Titus, broke through Jerusalem's fortifications following a lengthy siege. And then during the persecution that followed, Apostemos, who was a Roman centurion, publicly burned the Torah.
Wow.
And erected idols at the temple, both of which the Jews considered acts of extreme desecration. In 1239, Pope Gregory IX ordered the confiscation of all Talmudic manuscripts. In 1391, 4,000 Jews were massacred in Seville, 2,000 in Cordova, Spain. In 1944, the Kovno ghetto in Prague, Czech Republic, was liquidated. So you can see these are pretty major events that just sort of run through the course of Jewish history, traditionally, which fall on the 17th of Tammuz, but certainly all fall within the month of Tammuz. Ecclesiastes 7:2 reminds us that it's better to go to a house of mourning than to a house of feasting, for all are destined to be mourned. The living should take this to heart. Now, let me just say, you're like, well, I thought this was supposed to be encouraging. I mean, where's the light? No. Here's the good thing. It's important to talk about both, right? This is a month of both. And we're going to be talking about some amazing things that also happened this same month, because there is both good and bad. There is light and dark. There's kind of this duality that goes on during this month. And yes, it is sobering to consider things like this, because, you know, we take much more seriously, with much more sobriety, what we're doing with our choices, what we're doing with our time, what we're doing with our words, what we're doing with our actions. It helps us to be intentional about those things. And honestly, that's what we all want to be. We don't want to be 80, 85, 90 and be thinking about all the stuff we wish we would have done, all the stuff we wish we would have said. That's not where we want to be. So the way to avoid that is to kind of take stock. And that's one of the things I appreciate about this month. We'll be going a little bit more detail on that later, but it is sobering to consider this. But we also have to remember there is truly no such thing as darkness. There is only light. Darkness, rather, is simply the absence of light. Therefore, Tammuz, the month, is not just concerned with examining the darkness, but also the light, which, thankfully, woohoo. So let me cover a couple of cool things that did happen. So Noah releases the dove. So, I mean, we don't have videotape of this, but we're, 2100 BC, following the worldwide flood, Noah sends out the first dove to see if the waters had receded. Now, the dove did not find a place to rest, but his flight represented a gesture of hope, a hope that the work of repairing the world could finally begin. And that's awesome. That's awesome. After the sin of the golden calf, Moses ascends a second time. This is sort of like part two, right? He reascends Mount Sinai a second time to beg forgiveness on behalf of the Israelites and to begin the slow task of carving the commandments once again. Again, yes, it was bad, but now there's hope, right? And lastly, Ezekiel receives his vision of God. I'll just read this scripture briefly. It says in Ezekiel 1:1, in the 30th year, on the 5th day of the 4th month, which is this month, while I was among the exiles by the Chebar River, the heavens were opened and I saw visions of God. And let me tell you, if you ever see a vision of God, that is a good day. So
amazing.
It's an amazing day. Like it's good as it gets, right there. And so in the first verses that we're reading, I remember Ezekiel, who was at that time in exile with his people in Babylon, receives this mysterious, glorious vision of the third temple that would again house the glory of God on earth. And you might wonder, well, why would Ezekiel receive this vision during the month of Tammuz? This is the month of disaster, right? When the walls of Jerusalem were breached, the prelude to the destruction of the existing holy temple, the city razed to the ground. Like, why? Well, an answer, maybe, perhaps, could be that the Holy One chooses to send compassion to the people at the time of their pain, an assurance of his presence with them in the season of their exile. Tammuz thus contains both suffering and its remedy, hesed, which is loving kindness. And so the book of Ezekiel is especially noted for showing God's saving purposes in the history of the world and his future work in history. Therefore, this month, Tammuz, is a perfect time to ask the question, how does God's faithful loving kindness play a saving purpose in the world? And how can I partner with him in his healing and redemptive work? Which leads us to the focus of the month.
Yes. And I wanted to share a little bit about kind of adding to the Hebrew history that Dan was talking about, because it teaches that all the failing, suffering, and darkness of the Hebrew people throughout its history begins here at the golden calf.
Yeah.
So both of these months, Tammuz and the one we're about to enter into, Av, they were intended to be times of enormous blessing. God designed those to be the times when they would enter into the promised land, right? That's what he's leading them to. So when the Torah was revealed at Sinai, the people were overwhelmed by God's presence. So that's something to think about. When Moses was first bringing down, we were celebrating Pentecost back in the last month, right?
Right.
He went to the top of Mount Sinai, and actually God spoke to the people, and they were overwhelmed.
Yeah.
They were like, this, we can't handle this. So he went up to the top of Mount Sinai, and that's when he ascended for the first time, right? So he would spend the next 40 days working together with God, writing the Torah on those tablets. But unfortunately, the Israelites miscalculated, and they expected, they counted 40 days and expected Moses to return with the tablets in hand on the 16th. Well, it was a day later, and Moses did not show up, and they panicked. And it's interesting to note in the Hebrew history, we learned that the women did not.
Yeah.
It's funny. The women did not. Everybody resorted to their old ways, and they gave all of their gold, right? And the women did not.
Props to the women.
Yeah, that's amazing. So they resorted to their old ways, and they wanted to find, they panicked. They said, we need something that we can hold on to, that we can touch and see. And they went back to their graven images. So they, with Aaron's reluctance, he went with them, and he fashioned a golden calf, and they wanted to use this to replace Moses. And you think, what? So when Moses returned and he saw that the Israelites had quickly gone back to their old habits, he was so furious that he mashed them to the ground, right? He threw them down, and the moment of promise was lost. And so, like Dan was saying, after the golden calf was destroyed, Moses would go back a second time,
which was
to
good,
Mount
right?
Sinai, right? Where he would spend the next 40 days pleading forgiveness on behalf of the Israelites. And so you think about this, if the people had just waited one more day, right? The 17th of Tammuz would have marked a monumental paradigm shift in the history of Israel. But instead, it was the beginning of all of their woes.
You know what it makes me think? It's like, I don't know if you've ever heard that phrase, that the only thing harder than waiting on God is wishing that you had.
Oh, that's brutal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's probably something
we have to post that one.
Yeah. That's probably something the Israelites said.
Yeah.
I don't know. There's no quotes. There's no record of it, but I bet you they said that.
Yeah. I think that's so true. And even God is so merciful that even in our failings and in those darkest of times, he always plants healing tools inside of our hardships.
Yeah.
And since Tammuz is the month of this fall, it also provides a key to its repair. Because there's an association, like we said before, of the month of Tammuz to the letter Het, which is the sense of sight, light, and sight, right? And so these are spiritual tools that God provides us to repair the damage that occurred this month, during the month. So this is how we learn how to see in the dark. It's so interesting to think about that darkness is the absence of light, right? And we have this light in our eyes, and it's through our stumbling and our suffering that God trains us to see the good that hides in these ordeals and in the dark pits of our lives. Because sure, it's easy to see God in the fire and the dramatic fire of Sinai, right? But it's a whole nother level of maturity to see God in the darkness.
Yeah.
And it's when that hidden good becomes visible, it becomes revealed good, right? It's called a blessing in disguise. It's like when we can always look back on those hard times and realize why and what was happening. And what we really want to do is to bless us as individuals and as a community as we absorb these lessons into our hearts. So both the lessons that come through our study and what we're sharing, and the lessons that come through our ordeals, our losses, our trauma, all of those things.
Yeah.
And it's with that newly acquired light that we learn to see in the dark, and that even the slightest sliver of good becomes visible, and our heart and mind gives us the strength to rise and shine and turn darkness into light. So how do we do that?
I'm glad you asked.
Yeah.
Well, in a nutshell, guard your heart and your eyes. Okay. There's a couple of passages that I want to read from Deuteronomy, and then I want to just unpack it just a little bit. So the first passage is Deuteronomy 11, says, "See, I am setting before you today a blessing and a curse." Again, we go back to the duality of this month. There are choices, right? There's choices. And what a relief, because, it's kind of hard when you feel like, oh, I've got no choice, or, oh, I don't have any options, or, oh, right? That's a hard place to live under. So what God's ultimately offering is freedom. And he's hoping that we choose the blessing and not the curse, right? So that's part of guarding our heart, is setting our hearts on the right thing, right? The second part in Deuteronomy 30 says, "Look, I am presenting you today with, on the one hand, life and good, and on the other hand, death and evil. In that I am ordering you today to love Adonai, your God, to follow his ways, and to obey his mitzvot," or his law, his regulations and rulings. "For if you do, you will live and increase your numbers. And Adonai, your God, will bless you in the land you are entering in order to take possession of it. But if your heart turns away, if you refuse to listen, if you are drawn away to prostrate yourselves before other gods and serve them, I am announcing you today that you will certainly perish. You will not live long in the land you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. I call on heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have presented you with life and death, the blessing and the curse. Therefore, choose life so that you will live and your descendants." Now, here's the thing. There's a lot to unpack, but a couple of things I want to highlight in here is that God is not forcing himself on his people. He's offering them free will. And he's also saying this, and this is where I think a lot of times people get hung up, is they turn this into, oh, I have a list of things I have to do in order to please God and make him happy or whatever. Well, what God is really saying is, and I love this passage because it links it directly to goodness and life versus death and evil. It's kind of like the same thing as, if you had a child, would you want them to avoid eating a big ball of poison? Yeah, because it will kill them. It's not because you're like, well, I want to increase the number of rules and regulations in my child's life, so I'm going to just randomly assign this restriction on poison balls. No, you're doing it because you want your child to live, right? You don't want harm to befall them. That's the same intention that God has here. And I love in this passage because it lays it out. You can see God's heart in this. This is not about God just arbitrarily, I'm God, so I'm going to have a list of stuff that you should do and not do, and here it is. He's doing everything for our benefit. He's doing everything because he wants us to live in freedom, right? To experience his blessing, right? And the other thing is that he also mentions this notice of, if you're drawn away to worship other gods and serve them, right? How pointless is it? Like, why would you ever settle? It's kind of like, I don't want to cheapen God by reducing this to money, but it would be the somewhat equivalent of if someone offered you $1 or someone offered you $1 trillion. Do you really have to think about which option you would choose? Do you really have to do a pros and cons list of which option is better? No, it's obvious. It's obvious. And when we see clearly, then we see clearly that God is the no-brainer. God's way is the best way. It's the way that provides the most love, joy, happiness, and everything that's good is found in him. And that's that's important. And I love those two passages because there's a lot in there. We could say more, but that's all I want to leave it there for now.
It's so good. It's so important, so valuable. And it's, we can always say, well, hindsight is 2020, right? And, we don't know what it must have been like to be in the desert and to be in bondage for 400 years and come out and but it is also, but gosh, to see the Red Sea, to see the things, but it's so easy to go back and to do that. So powerful.
Yeah.
So powerful. One of the things too about this month is they call it the film strip month. And I remember when I first heard that, I was like, what does that mean? The film strip month. But it's a very important element. And you will soon see that this connects to the incredible weapon in the spiritual battle that is literally designed to defeat the spirit of fear. And what we were talking about earlier, how God always gives us, I think of that scripture, a way out, right? Yeah. He gives us that. So it's a month to look back at the events of your life and begin to see how they work together. So God is working out a good and a perfect plan for you. We know that the scripture says, for those who love him, God is always working for the good. He promises that. He promises to work things together for the good. And so just like the people we read about in the Bible, your own life tells a story. So if you look at your life frame by frame, some you will enjoy, some you will not, some you might even regret, right? We want to invite the Spirit to bring life into all of the frames and see how they link together. So to consider how God has worked in your life. So this is a month to think about these things. Where was your life before you chose to follow Jesus? Man, that's a first,
wow.
Thinking about that, right? Just thinking about that. So what are the battles that you have overcome? What's the healing that you have received? The blessings that God has given you? Your life tells a story. And is it your version or his? It's so powerful. And that's something that we want to focus on this month, is to take the time to write some things out. Think about that. Worship and devotion is what we do when we choose to trust in him. Otherwise, it's easy to build a golden calf.
Yeah.
It's so easy to go to something. And each step in our journey and in the Israelites' journey was a testing.
Yeah.
And each one demonstrated God's love and his ability to overcome the obstacle and take care of his people's needs. So each test illustrated the contrast between life with God and life without him. I think about that in my life, and all these things are starting to flash before my eyes when I think about that, is what it was like without him. And sometimes we have him, but we live like we don't.
Yeah.
We live in that fear.
Like a practical atheist.
Yeah.
Right?
When we live in fear. Yeah. So the Israelites wanted comfort and security now. They didn't want it in some promised land that they weren't thinking about the future. They weren't thinking about these things. They didn't know. They'd never seen it. So, but while they were waiting, they lost that faith and they responded in fear and insecurity, and they settled for the golden calf. But what if Israel had reviewed their film strip? What if they had considered all of the ways that God had demonstrated his love for them? What if? Can you imagine if they were looking just at the last 2 months, what had happened, what had transpired? So we know that worshiping idols is the height of foolishness, right? As though a statue could somehow help us. I think about the story of Abraham. And if you haven't ever heard this, when Abraham was a young boy, his father was an idol maker, and he had, like a store. And people would come in and buy idols from him.
This appears in the Midrash, by the way. Just to be clear, this is not, you didn't miss this part in your Bible.
Yeah,
this is from the Jewish Midrash.
So powerful. But this is young Abraham, who was, named Abram. But he, one night, and he would talk to his dad about it. One night he went into the store and he broke all of the idols. He broke them with a bat, and he took the biggest idol, and he did not break that one, and he set the bat next to the idol. And in the morning, when the dad came in and he saw everything smashed to bits, he said, "Oh my gosh." And Abram said to his father, "Oh, look, that idol must have done it." He's the big one standing there with the bat, right? And the dad said, he's an idol. He's a piece of metal or whatever he was.
Clay, or
Yeah. And he can't do that. And Abram was like, exactly. There's so much when you think about just what he had innately in him as a young man to see that. And so we know that it's foolishness, right? To think that a statue would do something.
Right.
But somehow we find idols in our own life.
Yeah.
Their work, there are relationships, there are status. It's our bank account, right? Our possessions. It could even be going to drugs or alcohol or food or things like that to bring us that security in the moment, right? We want to feel better right now. We want to feel something. We can even go to religion. We could go to things that are empty. So, but all those things leave us with a curse when we go to those things. So Deuteronomy 27:15, it says this: a curse on anyone who makes a carved or metal image, something Adonai detests, the handiwork of a craftsman, and sets it up in secret.
You know what's interesting is of today, and this is largely the result of the Greek mindset, is we worship ourselves. There's a lot. Now, again, don't get me wrong. The Bible says, love your neighbor as yourself. So the Bible isn't calling us to some weird self-hatred, okay? But people elevate themselves and believe essentially they are and operate as their own gods. And that's something that you see everywhere.
Yeah.
And it's something that we can do. Like I was sharing earlier a moment ago. I've had moments of my life where I have essentially lived as a practical atheist, even though I claim to be a follower of Jesus. So it's real, right? This struggle, this battle is real,
Yeah, it is. And in so many places, God says he's going to destroy your high places in Leviticus, cut down your pillars for sun worship, throw your carcasses, the carcasses of your idols, and he will detest you. Like big words.
Yeah.
Intense
God's
words.
intense about idolatry, but it's important to know why, right? It's important to know why. Because it's like it is the most futile thing that you can do. In that illustration of Abraham a moment ago, it's the most futile thing in the world to sit there and commit yourself, your life, your destiny, your future, your intentions on some chunk of metal or a piece of wood or a piece of clay. I mean, that's
right.
Just, and
and the worst part of idolatry is that we lose God's presence.
Yeah.
We lose his presence.
Yeah.
And because he says in Ezekiel, human being, this is in the Complete Jewish Bible, it says, he asked me, human being, do you see what they are doing? This horribly disgusting practice that the house of Israel is committing here, so that I must distance myself from my own sanctuary. And then he says, but you will see even worse abominations. So he's really talking here about the intensity and the sadness that he has of us going to something other than him. And even after all of the ways that he poured himself out to the Israelites, that he took them through the desert, that he gave them manna, that he gave them all of the things, and they still so quickly went to what they knew, their old habits. And that's something that we talk a lot about, is even after you go through healing and times of those things, that it's so easy to go back to the old habits.
Yeah.
And so there's so much that is a part of that. And I think that the most important thing, and something, so we're looking at the sin of the golden calf in the month of Tammuz. And really there's two very foundational things to look at in the month of Tammuz, is the sin of the golden calf. And the other one is, and what Dan talked a little bit about earlier, is the patriarch Reuben. Is the tribe that it's associated with is Reuben. And I think it's cool to talk a little bit about his story and understanding that.
So let me go a little bit deeper into Reuben. So we mentioned before, he's the firstborn of Jacob. He's born to a position of privilege because he is the firstborn, and in Jewish culture that gave you a lot of privilege. And then we talked about how his choices literally cost him all of that, just like it had cost Esau, just like it cost all of Israel, right, going to the promised land. But here's the thing. I find that a lot of times it's easy to mock things that happen in the Bible. Oh, that's so stupid, man. I mean, look what all God showed up for Israel, and then they go to a Catholic. Yeah, but they had been under slavery. Literally generations.
Yeah, generational.
Like their grandfather's great grandfather's great grandfather was
400
enslaved.
years. Yeah.
Okay, so this is a mindset.
Yep.
And now they didn't even know how to process their freedom. And all they knew was this harsh wilderness wandering around, and God was showing up for them. He was trying to demonstrate to them, I'm here for you. I can take care of you in a way that the gods of Egypt cannot. And he was trying to woo them, right? And they were taken in, but eventually they went back to their old ways, right? It's easy for us to go into old habits.
Right.
Is anybody out there ever done something that you knew was either self-destructive or unhelpful, but you did it anyway?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, me too. Okay, so it's like it's part of our human nature. So let's not, get all judgerton on Israel, right? But looking at Reuben, you might think, okay, but Reuben, man, I mean, gosh, dude, the guy he's set. Why would he just throw that all away? Well, let's just back up a little bit and review some of what's going on in his life. Jacob's family had been traumatized.
Yeah.
He escaped Laban, right? Laban comes after him, and then God finally turns him away. He has a confrontation with Esau, in which Esau, his brother, wanted to kill him. Okay. Dinah, right, is raped. And her
two brothers. His daughter?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then his two brothers, her two brothers, Simeon and why am I blanking? And Reuben. No, Simeon and Levi, actually. Anyways, they retaliated. Rebecca's nurse, and then those people that we retaliated against wanted to kill them. There's a confrontation. Rebecca's nurse died, who they were close to, and then Rebecca herself died in childbirth, giving birth to Benjamin. So that's a lot of trauma to process in an extremely short amount of time. I could understand, and I'm sure you could too, why all Reuben wanted was just a little bit of comfort. And that's why Bilhah, Jacob's concubine, became his little bit of comfort. She became essentially his golden calf. And as a result, both he and his descendants lost their inheritance. And interestingly enough, that decision had repercussions that went on. For example, when they finally were on their way to claim the promised land, they defeated Og, and they looked around at the land that Og had possessed, and they said, hey, we'll just settle right here. They hadn't entered the promised land yet. They were still on the east side of the river. And they're like, yeah, this is good enough. This is fine. They were willing to settle for that because they had been constantly attacked. They had been wandering in the desert. I mean, like all of that stuff. And then there was like, oh, you know what? A little bit of comfort. Anything is fine, right? So after 40 years in the wilderness, that's all Reuben wanted, was just a little bit of comfort. And I think it's very important for us to be mindful of settling for temporary comfort. And the only reason that we do that is because we start with our eyes to doubt that God is going to come through for us. And so that's why we're willing to settle for the comfort. When you know that, no, I have comfort is on the way, blessing is on the way, God is there for me, then that's when those things change. And so it's kind of like, this is, if you want an illustration of this in the Bible, I think Paul does a great job in Philippians 3. He says, brothers, I, for my part, do not think of myself as yet gotten a hold of it. In other words, Paul's saying, I haven't arrived yet, but there is one thing I do, forgetting what is behind and straining forward toward what lies ahead. I keep pursuing the goal in order to win the prize offered by God's upward calling in the Messiah Yeshua. And what is the prize? The prize is God's presence. his presence.
So good.
So to kind of wrap this up, we wanted to talk about a few things that you can do to sort of put this alignment with the month into action. Because as helpful as it is to get a little bit of context on the month, as it helpful it is to get a little bit of backstory, back history of what was going on, as helpful it is to look at the golden calf and Reuben and sort of draw out some life lessons from them, it doesn't do any good unless we put that alignment and that understanding into action. You know, it's kind of like that cliche about knowledge is power. Wrong. Knowledge applied is power. Knowledge applied is power. So we wanted to talk about some things that you can do to put this into action. One of those things is that as you are, again, this being a film strip month where you're sort of reviewing things, every day, write down in a journal at least one thing you are grateful for. At least one thing you're grateful for. You don't have to, if you want to write a bunch of stuff, more power to you, but just write one thing you are grateful for every day in your journal and just watch that list build. Again, it gives you something that says, oh, okay, I'm keeping in mind the goodness of God. I'm keeping in mind God's blessing. I'm keeping in mind God's activity in my life. Another thing to do is keep a list of every answered prayer. Every time God answers a prayer, great and small, because you know what? It's funny when you write it and you actually note it, you're like, wow, God's showing up a lot. Wow. I mean, he is in there for me. But it's very easy to forget that. It's very easy to feel like, well, I'm kind of wandering through my day alone. I don't know where God is. It's very easy to kind of get sidetracked into that when we're not being intentional about considering the ways in which God is answering our prayers,
right?
Big and small.
Yeah.
And when we do that, we go, wow. And when you are reminding yourself of how much God shows up for you, when you do face a temptation, when you do face the desire to reach out for the golden calf, whatever that is, you're like, nah, I'm not going to settle.
Right.
Why settle for so much less when God is offering so much more? Right?
Yeah.
Why settle for a piece of garbage tract of land on the east side of the Jordan River when I can have the promised land? Right?
Yeah.
Why settle for some piece of property in the middle of the desert where I can go like beachfront mansion?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's like that, right?
It's like that.
And so those are just a couple of things that you can start aligning into action. And that's something that you can take not just with this month, but into every month, into every season. You know, these are just sort of good principles, but in particular, because this month being the film strip month, these are just good practices to maybe start now and then carry forward the rest of the year.
And have them, like we were talking about earlier, that there is a weapon, there is a key, there is a way that if the Israelites could have allowed what God was doing in their life to penetrate and become forefront, they could have maybe sat there and said, okay, we don't know where Moses is. He's been gone longer than we thought he was going to be, but we know that God has shown up before. Look at the way he showed up here. Look at the way. And that is something that as we mature and we go through things, I can think of things of ways that God has shown up. It's kind of cool. Our daughter, Landry, is at camp right now, and she's a counselor, and she's gone for like 5 weeks. And man, it's hard because during the week we can't even talk to her on the phone. But she gets her phone like Saturday night,
which is
to
good,
Sunday.
But it's hard on us.
It's good, yeah. But it's really good. But she's in a different town every week. So just to bring how amazing God is. So she had a favorite worship leader at her church that really affected her. He was very pivotal in her walk. He was part of her when she tried out for the worship band, and he was there, the worship and everything at the church. And he ended up leaving the church before she went off to college. And it was kind of the kind of thing where she wasn't able to ever say hello or goodbye, or, and he was off staff, he was gone, and it was kind of nobody was talking about it. And anyway, it was really hard for her. She wrote him an email just to get her heart out, and done. So this week we got to talk, and she's in this little, like, she's outside of Houston, and we got to talk to her Saturday night for a while. And so the next morning I get this text from her, And we were out for Father's Day having breakfast, and she gives me this uppercase "Mom!" exclamation point. The guy is leading worship at the church that she is at. And she was so blown away at how God spoke through seeing him. They were able to talk after, and he mentioned her email and how much that affected him. It was just like God in the midst of this, because she's told me, she was like, I literally had woken up for the first time in 3 weeks feeling very homesick, feeling like, I don't know if I could do this for 2 more weeks. And I said, how cool is it that God was just like, wait till week 3.
Yeah.
Just wait
Just
till
wait.
you see what
Just
I
wait.
have to encourage you on week 3. And what was kind of cool is it was encouraging for him too, because he doesn't go to that church. He doesn't work at that church. He had been invited to that church that day to perform for the worship, to do the worship. So, and he was so encouraged to see her, and he told her, you know, how much her email had meant. And anyway, she was blown away. So there's all these ways that God shows up. And if we don't write those down, we can forget.
Yeah.
We can so easily forget. And so this is the month for the, like we said, the film strip month, right? So to write these things down. And if you are with us in our Inspired Life membership, we are going to have our first Zoom coaching call this Thursday night. I'm so excited. So we're going to be meeting every month on Zoom to be able to talk about this stuff, to be able to hear from you, hear your stories and hear your film strips and hear some things. So we'll be posting stuff. We are working on our app. We will be having our app, which is where we're by the end of the month. No, we're having it.
No, we are. No, we're doing it. Hear me.
No,
it's happening.
It's happening.
It's just, you know,
we're our goal is to have it up and going by Friday. So
exactly.
We'll have a lot of stuff in there, but for this week, for this month, the focus is, what are the things, how has God really shown up in your life that you can have on the forefront? So when things come in that cause doubt, that cause fear, there's a lot of things going on in our world right now that cause fear and chaos and uncertainty. And it's so incredible when you can be that grounded. And it is a spiritual maturity, right? It is as we grow up and we experience life that we have these times that we can really latch onto. So that is our call. If you are in our group, you also got a planner. And so we are going to have some time this week to go over that. We'll be doing also that in Zoom, talking about all that. So we are very excited. We love you guys so much. We're going to stop here because we're almost at an hour mark already. So crazy. So have a beautiful rest of your day. And tomorrow, remember, it's Rosh Chodesh. Take some time to rest. Take some time to make it special. Maybe sit down with God and thank him for all the ways that he has shown up in your life, and to remember that. Remember God. So we wish you guys shalom.
Shalom.
Yes. Peace.